Roll call.
Commissioner Hernandez,
I am present.
Commissioner Polgar. Here. Commissioner Reddick,
Present.
Vice Chair Benjamin,
Present.
and Chair Holt.
Present.
We have all 5 commissioners present this evening.
Okay, next item is approval of minutes from September 24th.
Through the chair. I have a number of changes. I made copies for everybody and for staff. Glad to share them. And I can walk through them if you like. They're not out the door or nothing. I just wanted to I apologize. This is why I was late. It's a printer at 6:52. I don't think any of these are controversial, but maybe you can help me since this is important if we miss anything. The first was we made a note that Mr. Ferreira commented that he supported the Committee for Green Foothills letter. He accepted as in ACC rather than EXC, accepted. And then there was a section of text in Planning Commission comments where we responded to the Coastal Commission's comment about the natural resources area. And I think, if I remember the sense of the commission, we said there were some parts that could move out to an appendix. The text said natural resources section is a bit of a stretch and could go somewhere else. And of course, I don't think we meant, and we certainly could not move the natural resources section out of the LCP. There were, sorry?
We meant the table that you were discussing.
Okay, that sounds, and the table contained what, just so we have clarity? It was the natural history.
It's a redundant listing of the species that are already discussed in the narrative and also discussed in the narrative relative to habitats and presented in additional tables.
Right, so removing redundant information, thank you. And then there was a combined comment with respect to PD fallback zoning and thinking about preserving the public works planning. Those were 2 separate comments. Then there was a reference to supporting a change to Upper Grandview, Glen Cree. And since we had previously talked about as a change having a PD zoning there, I just wanted to clarify that we were talking about reverting to the subdivision in the Upper Grandview area and leaving Glen Cree alone. That was what, of course, that conversation is still taking place, but that's where we were yesterday, or at the last meeting. Then with respect to drainages in the PDs being a critical understudied infrastructure, I remember Commissioner Polgar echoing that thought as well. And I just wanted to emphasize in our conversation, we didn't just mean inside the PD, because drainages start above the PD and they go below the PD. They can abut the PD. And it's a critically understudied infrastructure in all of those areas. With respect to the comment that we make sure numbers are baked into priority overlay, this was about recognizing if there are increased units as a result of density bonuses or for any other reason, when we're assessing the capacity of infrastructure that's needed to support it, we are saying let's have all those numbers in place and make sure that we're not piling more stuff on top of them when we think about it. Then with respect to, there was a comment overlay concerned about issues and want to learn from mistakes. Maybe somebody else said something about that, but I think that was my comment. And the idea here was environmental scientists and biologists look at their failures. They know when they look at situations where they thought they had a good idea and it didn't go well. And the comment here in housing was to say we need to adopt an analogous openness to understand what does not go well. This, what you may recall me referring to them as understanding the dumpster fire problems. With respect to school district housing, speed up the process. I actually don't recall anyone saying that. Okay, someone did. With respect to buffers for housing, I think, just to clarify, I think this was support for Mr. Ferrera's point about having room to maintain housing without encroaching into the buffer area. With respect to ag land and food production, the idea here was Mr. Salome pointed out that in an era of climate change, we may have food security issues, and the idea is we want to be able to revert and do agriculture for food if the need arises and find ways to facilitate that. And I have no idea what the reference is to comments about energy interesting is. I just don't remember. Then with respect to the vertical trail at Poplar Beach that we considered, there was a Q&A that included the question, do the conditions include the V-ditch? And the answer was not included. Of course, the V-ditch was in the drawing, so it's there. I think the question was, is the maintenance of the V-ditch included? And I think the answer to that was no. Maybe someone else can tell me if they remember it differently. Those were my, oh, and then there was a question about how the public finds out that they can't use it. And I think, if I recall, the concern that was being raised was, could we put signage at the pay kiosk and some kind of signage where the barriers are that would prevent people from trying to go down the trail under construction. But I believe it was about construction. And then the bonfire comment was about handrails and steps. So that was a lot to go through, and I apologize to the commission for, I wanted to get it in the record for the public, and I wanted staff to have the written copy. So those are my suggested, requested changes to the minutes.
Is there any discussion on the changes or need for clarification from staff?
Through the chair.
Commissioner Hernandez.
I don't think I recalled speeding up the process as a comment I made, other than we need to think about school district housing and do what we can to improve the process. The comment on the V-ditch, I remember we had a lengthy discussion led by John Dowdy around the V-ditch. I would appreciate any comments the city has about the maintenance on that item. Otherwise, I'm fine with the comments that have been raised by Commissioner Benjamin.
So I appreciate through the chair, excuse me. So I appreciate the clarification on the school district. That's how I do recall you mentioning having a better process rather than a faster process.
Okay. Jill.
We just want to be sure that the most important part of the Poplar access item, the motion as written with respect to signage, et cetera, is satisfactory, because that's really what we're most concerned about.
It was fine with me. I don't recall there being any modification to that in the motion.
Okay. So do we have a motion and a second? I was absent, so I will be recusing myself from the meeting.
I'll move that we approve the minutes with the changes, was it except for the comment about speeding up the process? Sorry. I think that was the only one.
I second the motion.
All in favor?
Yes.
Aye.
Moving on to public comment. This is the opportunity for the public to comment on items not on the agenda. I don't have any public comment cards, but I do believe we're going to have Mr. John Dowdy speak to us about the pending PG&E outage.
Stole my thunder, Chair. Jeez. I bring good tidings. Honestly, I bring nothing good, I think, tonight, but I do bring some information. We have been working closely with our partner agencies throughout the county to try to figure out what, in fact, PG&E is going to do and how do we react and respond to this proposed event. as we speak. Hopefully some of you, if not all of you, are on our listserv for the press release, and there's a lot of information in that. I will try to just cover some of that for you tonight and for the community, and attempt to answer any questions that you might have, given the unique circumstances that we face. So tomorrow, 12 noon, all indications are that the power will shut down in Half Moon Bay, as well as the coast side area, and extending down into Santa Cruz County itself. And basically this would affect areas from basically Devil's Slide south into Santa Cruz, and cover the areas that we're concerned about, I guess, west of 280. So everything west of 280 is what we're talking about. So what does that mean? That means that if in fact they proceed tomorrow with that closure, we are going to have some challenges when it comes to travel, transportation, a lot of activities. We are concerned about the health of individuals, particularly those that have special medical needs and issues. And so we are trying to work through and figure out all the implications and things that we can do to improve that. As I said, at this point we're looking at 12 noon tomorrow. The forecast put this weather event that's causing this closure of our system, shutdown of the system, to run about 24 hours. So they are anticipating about midday on Thursday for the weather event to be done and the wind issues to be down to more normal, and the humidity issues. What does this say beyond that point? It says that it could be a matter of hours to up to 5 days before PG&E conducts their inspections of the lines and powers up various sections of the grid across 800,000 now customers that is affected by this action. So we have no idea, and no one, I can assure you, that we've been speaking to has any clue as to what their priorities are going to be and how they're going to proceed with that. So at this point, we are using the terms shut down at 12 noon tomorrow, and until such time as the power is restored, because we have no clue exactly what time that will be. And if you call us and ask us, we'll tell you the same thing tomorrow and the next day. So it's best just, you don't have to call us. We'll tell you when we know anything and deal with that. At this point, we are going to have a partial activation of our EOC, and just to make sure that we are coordinating efforts along the coast side regionally and working with county OES for that purpose. At this point, we are going to be looking at our EOC being operating just simply out of the conference room behind you. This facility will actually be used as a place for folks to come get water, charge their electrical items, phones, computers, meet, talk, get information, and bathroom break, whatever it may need that they're out there and dealing with that. So we'll be staffing this facility as well as being operating the Emergency Operations Center there. At this point, we are not, and we've been recommended that we don't activate the volunteer groups at this point, as this was a planned activity, as much as planned as 2 days notice could be. But we're not at this point looking at activating those different volunteer groups. That could change as events change and unfold. Key to this, from a transportation wise, is the Tom Lantos tunnels will be closed for the duration of this time. So don't go north. And if you're in Pacifica, don't come south. That's we understand from the March incident when all of this occurred, at least we're getting but reasonable notice on this, that it's going to be shut down, and basically by noon tomorrow, they will be blocked at both ends, at Second on this side and in Lindemar, somewhere at that point where the bridge is in Pacifica. At this point, Cabrillo Unified School District is indicating that they are remaining open and will continue to remain open. I think we're going to continue to have conversations. We're not horribly concerned about tomorrow because at noon shutdown, and then they have their 3 o'clock, 3:30, 4 o'clock kind of releases. It should not be a huge implication. We are very concerned about what Thursday morning commute, Friday morning commute, if this continues on, will be like with 4-way stops only all throughout the Highway 1 and 92 corridor. So that's a great concern for us, and we'll be having conversations with Cabrillo Unified on that issue, at least talking to them perhaps about a late start or something of that nature to try to offset the main implications. The question came up before, will the traffic signals be working? The answer is no. They'll be flashing some of them will be flashing for a period of time, anywhere between 3 and 6 hours, the red flashes, and then those will go out, the ones that have battery backup. The others will basically just go into dead mode. So we have sawhorse stop signs. They'll be placed out at each of the intersections and ready to go on as soon as the shutdown occurs. So we're ready to go, and our maintenance crew is prepared and has put those together. So please be safe in those areas. I think the best thing that we can say is if you don't need to go out, don't go out. If you don't need to go out in the major rush times, stay away, let the other folks get through. You'll only be probably frustrated and irritated and then calling us about your frustrations and irritations that we can't do much about. We apologize. We just don't know what to do except to do the best we can. CHP is very involved in this process, the Sheriff's Office as well as Caltrans, and we're doing what we can to make sure it's the best it possibly can. But once we go to four-way stops on all of those intersections, it just slows everything down to a creepy crawl. As far as the city goes, the City Hall will remain open at least for tomorrow, and we'll see what happens beyond that point. We need to see how stable our server is with the generator power and with all the other service issues going on, and we'll make some decisions at that point. And we're also going to try to stagger starting time on Thursday and Friday if need be, around the issue of a later start for our staff, just so we're not in the middle of creating part of the problem for rush hour time. So we're working ourselves on that issue. We have decided to go ahead and close the Ted Adcock Center for the 3 days, and in part so we can staff here and deal with some of the other response and issues we need to do. The other part of that is a drain and a draw on the generator that serves this building, and this building as the EOC building as well as the sheriff's substation we feel is the most critical piece to that, and we prefer not to put a drain and strain on that generator. It can operate both, but our preference is to just focus on this one area and deal with that. And so we apologize. We'll be canceling all the recreation programs as well. We are also been informed that PG&E will have a water station, charging station area in the parking lot of the new Pasta Moon, 845 Main Street, during the daylight hours tomorrow. So if you need to charge your phone, get some water, go to the bathroom, you're welcome to go there. We had to double check on that one and double take on the parking lot at the new Pasta Moon, but it is in fact the parking lot of the new Pasta Moon, and they have been asked and they said okay to that. And we will have public phone numbers that's in the press release. If you look at those and deal with that, and that we'll be able to answer phone calls tomorrow and for the foreseeable future. So there's I'm sure more that out there, but I'm happy to stop now.
Well, thank you for all that. You have plenty of thunder. Are there any questions of the commissioner?
Thank you. two questions. For people who are concerned about being able to communicate, do we know if the information infrastructure or the cell phone infrastructure is going to be affected by this?
At this point, we believe that AT&T service will be unaffected by this. At least the fiber optic should not be affected by this. So if you're, I guess, fortunate enough to be served by the AT&T fiber optic, you should be okay as long as, I guess, you have battery up, you know, backups and everything for your laptop or computer systems. But that structure should be okay. Comcast is probably going to be a challenge with that regard. We just don't know. Frankly, they can't tell us exactly what's going to happen at this point. The cellular service is, again, sort of an unknown. The cell towers run off of the grid, and at least some of them typically have some form of backup generators, but we don't know exactly which ones and what people's service is getting to that point. So that remains a question, and it also remains a question of how long perhaps that service is around. The other thing is that, remember, in an emergency event, all the cell services go to prioritize 911 and emergency service calls. So even if the cell service is working and functioning, because of the other activities and the other phone systems going through a deal with that, there still may get a point where it's you know, circuits are busy and it may be an issue for you. So that's a challenge. And obviously, if your VoIP systems are impacted by this, if you have voice over internet, that can be a challenge. And many people don't have hardline phones now anymore.
And then one other question. For those of us who live north of Highway 92 who have been treated to nighttime paving operations, for citizens who are thinking they can circumvent the traffic disaster and get to their job over the hill by leaving at 5 a.m. or whatever that time is, do we know if Caltrans paving operations are going to continue to force the one-way controls and make that sort of pile on to the likely increased demand?
They've assured me they're going to shut that down, but they're going to start some tree work on 92 just to add fun to this.
You're making that up.
They are working. Yes, I'm making that up. They are working tonight, but their plan is to suspend work for the next 2 nights until power is restored. So they understand the challenges and issues with that paving project too. So that's what we've been told.
Are there any other additional questions of the commission? Okay, Steve.
Thanks for all that, John. I read in an update today that the Water District says they don't anticipate any disruption in their services. So I'm hoping that means that water will still flow from their customers' faucets during the outage.
We have been in contact with CCWD. They have assured us that their system has all the backup power and the systems in place with their treatment facilities that they can convey, and there will be no issues with your water service. We have also been in contact with SAM. They've been topping off their tanks, and they are prepared to go on to generators. So when you drink and that water goes through the system, it should also go back into the treatment plant and be processed fine as well. So cradle to grave.
I did see one question from the public, and this is a unique situation, so I'm happy to take it. If you just want to holler it out, I'll repeat it back over. So for our audience at home. So I was just going to repeat for if people are watching at home, the question was if either this facility or the library will continue to have web access.
So didn't mention that because it's still on a little bit of a question. If the power goes out at noon tomorrow, or I'll still stay on the if, the library will close. It has no backup generator, and it will be closed until they have power. So that's what will happen here. Again, this will be open and available. There is a Wi-Fi that we'll certainly make available to folks. Again, it is all dependent on how stable our server and system is in terms of how much we can provide and what services are available. And frankly, we know it'll be a little slow and a little wobbly, but we think it'll be functioning. But you're welcome to come here and access as long as it works.
Great. Well, this all makes converting over to solar sound very attractive, but appreciate that, John. All the good information, and we'll see what happens. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I don't have any other general public comment cards now, so with that, we'll close the public comment period, and we'll move to our first public hearing item, the continued item on the local coastal land use plan update study session.
Good evening, Chair Holt, Commission, and community members. Thank you for attending. Reminding everyone that this is a study session, not a decision-making meeting. And further reminding the room that under the Political Reform Act, the Commission can oversee general plan and local coastal program updates. However, when it comes to matters concerning specific parcels on maps, individual commissioners may need to recuse themselves. The commissioners are well informed about this and will acknowledge if there are specific sites they would like to discuss. If that is the case, we will make sure to give commissioners who may have a conflict an opportunity to excuse themselves for that portion of the discussion. And this session will follow our standard format, and Brittany will begin our presentation.
Good evening, Commissioners. So as we touched on at the last study session, staff has had ongoing conversations with Coastal Commission staff about their letter submitted on September 23rd to better understand the intent of several of their comments and to work through potential concerns on both ends. Tonight we will go through these 5 main topics of the Coastal Commission staff's letter, present initial staff recommendations, and look for questions and concerns from the Planning Commission and the public. So the first topic is document length. As the Coastal Commission staff and several members of the public have pointed out, the draft land use plan update is lengthy and contains background information and policies that are beyond the scope of Coastal Act requirements. Coastal Commission staff has reiterated the intent of the land use plan, which is to implement the Coastal Act and to guide review of coastal development permit applications. Their suggestions include reducing or removing background information and programmatic policies that do not achieve either of these purposes, and either moving these types of information into an appendix or into a separate supportive or working document such as a general plan element. Staff also notes that such policies or narrative could also be reworded and retained in the land use plan if there is a relation to implementing the Coastal Act or guiding development review. So Coastal Commission staff provided 2 examples of such programmatic policies that aren't directly applicable to guiding development review, one from the Public Works chapter and one from the Coastal Hazards chapter. So staff took the time to consider these examples and think about where else in the document these could be found and where else they could go. So we identified that programmatic policies from the development chapter, public works chapter, agriculture, cultural resources, and scenic and visual resources could all be moved into a complementary land use element. In addition, anything of this nature in the natural resources chapter would be appropriate in the open space and conservation element, and in the coastal hazards chapter into the safety element. So based on the Coastal Commission staff's examples, staff put together a preliminary list, somewhat of a first stab of reading through the entire land use plan draft and identifying this more programmatic language in our policies. This was an attachment to the staff report, and you'll see a bit of a color scheme where we found that it was a little more of a straightforward, this is absolutely programmatic, it's a study or it's establish a program or something along those lines that could certainly be found in a general plan element rather than the land use plan. Yellow was where we weren't sure and would appreciate some guidance on, because there was either some connection to the Coastal Act, it was a major topic of concern for the public or the Planning Commission or the City Council, or it could help guide development review in some respect. So just to reiterate, this was a first stab, and we are welcome to input. All right, the second topic was redesignating the PDs, the planned developments. So the intent of the Coastal Commission staff's letter was to redesignate the PDs to reflect their actual or intended land uses. Just call it what it is, get rid of the, or simplify the PD designation, which is a little easier for the developed PDs where there is an actual land use where we could easily categorize it into residential or commercial or whatnot. So the Coastal Commission's input was to, if you can't do them all, at least do the developed ones. So we wanted to note that this has happened already in our draft land use plan in a couple different areas. The two blue highlighted rows here note where there's parcels that are not in planned development land use designations currently, but are proposed as planned developments for the draft land use plan update. And in yellow, you'll see a number of PDs or portions of PDs where staff has already proposed to redesignate in a different land use in this current draft. So that applies to the Guerrero Avenue PD, the Stolowski Gonzalez, the areas A and B of Pacific Ridge, Palacios West Urban Reserve, significant portions of North Wavecrest, and the 400 and 408 Redondo Beach Road parcels. So these, again, are all changes that have already been made in the current draft prior to the Coastal Commission input. And just for reference, this map is here. If anyone wants to go back to it, just as a reminder of where these things are. So the Coastal Commission staff's letter, again, said at least consider redesignating the developed PDs. In thinking about the intent behind the comment, staff is also putting out there that there could be several undeveloped PDs that could also be redesignated. They either are a little more straightforward as far as site constraints or ownership or subdivision patterns and could easily fit into one of our land use categories. and I'll pass it to Jill.
All right, thank you, Brittany. So one of the reasons why we wanted to present those PDs that are already being proposed to be redesignated is to show that there's quite a bit of alignment already in your draft land use plan with Coastal Commission direction, and it just might not have been that obvious. So we're trying to be really transparent about this and make it very, very clear where these are going. Now, moving on to the next batch of PDs, the ones that are developed, as well as I think there's a couple that are not, where we've presented some options in your staff report. We'd like to go through those one by one for a few minutes and remind the room that these are land use designations. This is your policy document. This is not zoning. This is not the zoning code. And in fact, there's no rezoning proposed specifically in association with these considerations at this point. It's possible that land use designations can change and we could still end up with a PUD zone. So we have more research to do on that, but we just keep hearing feedback and a lot of concern about rezoning, and that's a little bit different than what this is about. This is higher level, more general. Okay, we'll start with Casamira. There are actually several of these that are fairly straightforward because they have a single land use, and the land use is actually wholly consistent with these very general definitions that you have in your land use plan. So for example, Casamira could go into a residential medium density land use designation and conform to the density of that. We note that on the table tonight and presented to you that there's a staff memo. It includes a response to several comment letters that we received after the packet went out. One of those was from the Committee for Green Foothills, who actually had a comment on the Casamira designation. They had a concern about maybe needing to include a hazard overlay, but we note that there are hazard policies in Chapter 7 that would actually address that. So it's possible to do this change, and of course we do some more study about it, but we want to be clear that there's all kinds of parts and pieces of your land use plan that take care of some of those types of concerns that we're seeing brought forward. Okay, the next one is Matucci. Again, this one was also brought up by Committee for Green Foothills, exactly along the lines of what staff has been working through here. It's possible for it to go into a low density designation. The low density designation residential allows for up to 2 dwelling units per acre. This would conform to that. The concern though for this one is where would it land in zoning later if it isn't a PD? We really don't have a zoning district for it to land in, and that's why we brought up at your last meeting a notion about coming up with a rural residential land use designation that could have a scaling for different areas, similar to your R1B2, R1B3, where you have different minimum lot sizes in the R designation. A rural residential designation could require a half an acre parcel or some other appropriate minimum lot size so that we could preclude future subdivision, because there is no intent for future subdivision in this PD. It wasn't approved to have anything more done than what was already set up in its planned unit development plan. So there are definitely tools for how to deal with that. The next one is Pacific Ridge, and you already heard Brittany present about areas A and B. Now, areas A and B have been recommended for the new designation contemplated in this land use plan of open space for purposes of conservation as opposed to open space reserve. The open space for conservation land use designation would be a new arrival in this land use plan, and it was a concept that came out of your GPAC. And so this has been in the public discourse for several years, and it was confirmed through our ad hoc committee work. And it's been in this draft land use plan showing areas A and B in this conservation designation. So we're not talking about areas A and B. We're talking about the 62 approximately parcels that you see in the highlighted areas. And there's also some additional space that was carved out for this. There was a notion that maybe there could be a park in the middle there, but of course we all know that's a drainage channel and it's way too steep and not appropriate for a park. So really the focus here is on this residential portion, and it would be within the density range of the low density or the medium density designation, depending on how we calculate it. We need to do some more look at it, but it's single use residential. It is not complex. That said, we know the backstory is very complicated. We've heard about it, we've studied it, we're well aware of that. When the city's accessory dwelling unit ordinance came through about a year ago, this was an area that was considered whether or not ADUs should be appropriate in that area. And we already did research at that time to see if zoning amendments were in conflict with the settlement agreement and other considerations there. We can go back and revisit that. We know that you've got that comment on the record from a previous meeting. It comes forward again in new information that we have in writing tonight, and we would imagine you'll hear it again. We just want to reassure you that we understand that comment, and we will do the research. Next. All right, so some are easy, some are not. Carter Hill, the development constraints in this area make this site, this collection of parcels, difficult to plan for regardless of the land use designation approach, due to slopes, very high fire hazard zone. We also have a little bit of public facilities use in this area with the water tanks. And so we're showing one idea for the low density designation. Similar to Matucci, we'd really need to have some ability to not allow further subdivision. And of course, the water tanks could go into a public facilities designation. So your staff can work with it either way, but this is one that we'd be very comfortable pushing back a little bit on Coastal Commission staff just to see if they may rethink whether or not it would be more appropriate, because this is such a complex part of town, and that's really the intention for what a PD does. Next. Okay, so this is the Andreotti Pd. It's mostly developed. And the Andreotti Pd includes Cypress Cove, which is the townhouse development off of Stone Pine. And it also includes the Stone Pine Shopping Center and the adjacent office buildings. Already in your land use plan, we've proposed to remove Carter Park. Carter Park was a part of this PD. We would much rather have it be in some kind of a park designation with, of course, we were proposing an overlay for dealing with riparian corridors and the like, because knowing that they change in size and frankly sometimes orientation over time, we wanted flexibility with that. But other than that, this is almost developed, except for you see the portions out on Highway 92. In your draft plan, there's quite a bit of work was done in trying to set up policies for this, because some of it needs to be managed with regards to what's already developed versus having policies for the portions that are not developed. Your staff would be very comfortable putting this into standard land use designations and bringing forward zoning that aligns with it later. In particular, the Stone Pine shopping center and the office park could easily fall into the general commercial category. And of course, the housing would fit into one of the residential designations. I think that one worked with medium density. The Highway 92 frontage parcels remain challenging because we've talked about access and needing to have a low trip generating land use there. The most obvious ones to us are light industrial, and in particular, perhaps light industrial with a live-work type of component. If that was of interest, and frankly, that's what your PD right now, the draft aims that area too, there can be zoning that could be brought forward that would work with that. There are other policies in the land use plan that address the need for consolidating access along the highways. We can go back and make sure that 92 is addressed appropriately. But this is one that we think could work. Committee for Green Foothills letter was generally supportive of this. They were, of course, interested, and this has come in your public comment previously, in how to retain the Andreotti historic presence on that property. We'd love to hear how to do that. It's hard because this was already developed, and that really, frankly, wasn't accommodated at the time. It would have been great if one of the streets had been named in that way or some other way. So we're happy to think about it more, but we'd love people's ideas on that, some problem solving together. Next one, Main Street Park. This one's easy-ish. We think it's actually quite easy, but we do want to reassure people. It fits the medium density designation. It's fully developed. It's owned, operated, and really overseen by Mid-Peninsula Housing, and it was built in 2 phases. Both phases have 55-year affordability requirements. They're fully documented in the housing element and in other places. We saw that Committee for Green Foothills was generally supportive, assuming that the affordability is not compromised, and it would not be compromised by changing the land use designation or even putting it into zoning later. That affordability requirement stands on its own. So that is available. And in fact, your certified local coastal program for this PD doesn't mention affordability. So it's not really taking care of that issue now. So we think you're okay. South Downtown Gateway, this is one of the undeveloped PDs where the certified local coastal program even suggests in its language that this one doesn't need the rigor of what the other PDs require. In fact, it doesn't require a specific plan for developing this PD. It requires a level of a site and design review. So it's different from the others. And in fact, to quote the narrative on this PD in the certified LCP, they call it a modified general commercial designation. So if you wanted to move it into commercial visitor serving or commercial general, either one would be consistent with what South Downtown Gateway, or this is known right now as the LC Smith PD. So that's one to consider, and it would probably not change the review too much. Most of the policies for that PD, standing in the book now, are really focused on getting the corner to be a good gateway and having a portion of the land area put forth for some kind of a gateway feature. And in fact, the city has approved gateway signage and landscaping and all these other things on that corner as it is. So this has been addressed. The 20% open space requirement is also important, and that can be, you can get to that through land use designations and zoning quite easily. So it's possible. If you're interested in doing that one, we can work on it. Next, we pretty much go north to south. So on our way to the end of, south end of town, we come upon the hardest one, Ocean Colony. In your memo, attachment 2 is a email that we received today from a resident of Ocean Colony. I've been receiving phone calls and fielding them, and I'm going to be meeting with folks about this. We note that this is certainly not a single-use plan development. It has a long history. There are numerous subdivisions included in it. Some of them had specific plans, some of them do not. There are some options for doing this. Perhaps at the land use designation level, it wouldn't be too complex, but to change the zoning, there could be unintended consequences, and staff we'd be really concerned about how to wade through this one. This is one where we would be, given the comments that we received and in consideration of just how large it is, and frankly that we're really not having any problems with it, and it's not too hard to manage, other than the fact that we don't have setbacks in our book. We would like to maybe have some guidelines for how to deal with Ocean Colony that would not be code, not be zoning, that we could go back to the Coastal Commission staff with these comment letters that we're receiving and it's expecting more of, and see if they've thought through some more about that one. South Wave Crest is the last of these. Unfortunately, we come back to what could be a relatively simple change. This consists of a golf course and an RV park. Both are commercial visitor serving uses. You have a land use designation that is appropriate for that. And so that's a possibility, and at this general level, we think that could be done. So next slide. These are the rest that we haven't talked about. So in the certified land use plan right now, there are 19 plan developments. Nurseryman's Exchange is the 19th. And so if we were to do some or all of the above, these 7 undeveloped PDs would remain as PDs, and then maybe you'd also have Ocean Colony or maybe some of these others that you're not comfortable moving on, noting that 2 are in the town center, Podesta and the Stone Pine Conservation Corridor PD, and 5 of these are outside. I've already, I think, sort of woven in a discussion of how future zoning options might work with some of these as examples, so I won't dig into that right now. But do remember that in some cases we would have to come up with a new district, and that's we're very mindful of doing that. And now we're going to stay in the PD topic, but we've got a different slant on it, and Brittany's going to pick that up.
Thank you. So the next overarching comment from Coastal Commission staff was regarding the level of specificity in the PD policies of the draft land use plan update. And the intent there was really to allow for a flexible master planning process and future Coastal Commission certification. The master plans do require a land use plan amendment, which would be certified by the Coastal Commission. So their more specific direction was to remove the quantification from each of the PD sections, as well as the specific policies. You saw the example of Venice Beach as an attachment to your staff report for tonight's study session. And that was provided to us by Coastal Commission staff, the strike-through underline example. So it essentially left the summary table and the narrative of the PDs, keeping the high-level discussion of the site constraints and the envisioned land uses in that summary table and narrative. So we would like to note that reducing that level of detail in each individual PD section would not only address the Coastal Commission staff's concerns, but a number of PD landowner concerns, as you saw in many of the public comment letters attached to the staff report from our last study session. Staff would like to note that there should be very close care taken to make sure that each individual PD opportunity and constraint is still addressed in the narrative as well as in the factored policies. These would remain and apply across the board to the remaining 7 or give or take PDs. So we want to make sure that we're not losing anything that is specifically intended to guide development review again. And then we would have the narrative to support the vision for developing that PD out. A good example of this is the height limit in undeveloped PDs that provide broad ocean views. Right now, your existing land use plan limits these areas to have a 15-foot height limit for new structures. And that's contained in the Scenic and Visual Resources chapter of the existing land use plan. We pulled that out and applied them in the individual PD policies. So we want to make sure that that either gets retained in the Scenic and Visual Resources chapter or is kept in those factored PD policies. Just as an example of what we need to make sure we go through and don't lose that detail on. We also received some clarification from Coastal Commission staff that although we are being directed to take the quantification out with respect to the maximum estimated development, that staff calculated after the net acreage calculation, we can still use those numbers for our build-out estimates. It's just going to be a more general, whole PD category. We don't need to specify each individual PD maximum development anymore, but we can use these numbers as they apply to our infrastructure planning. So north and south of 92 for our traffic models, et cetera. And Jill will go over converting the reserve lands.
So this was that input from Coastal Commission staff regarding all of the quote-unquote placeholder designations, which is how they were noting to us that open space reserve, urban reserve, and the planned developments all kind of contribute to what we might call kicking the can in our land use plan. So that was never our intent, and I think the ad hoc committee knows more than anybody that's why we worked so hard on those factored PD policies, and then of course trying to have a platform for estimating potential build out that could certainly be revised through master planning. With respect to urban reserve and open space reserve, the whole focus has been on recognizing that these reserve lands had been part of a really set up as a tiering process to come after the PDs. We didn't propose to change that, and that in fact what property owners really wanted was more land uses that were compatible and supportive to agricultural or ag compatible uses to have a longer term economically viable use of these properties, regardless of what they're in, if they're actually field ag or maybe we've got horse breeding, then we have other related uses like equestrian uses for commercial use. That's similar to having land with maintenance of prime soils and without a lot of development on it, but could make some money in other ways that are related to and helpful to the owner and operator. And so you saw us working really hard on several rounds of feedback that we had from landowners, trying to put more information in the plan about what those kinds of uses could contain. We're trying to make real clear that ag uses that are ongoing with our ponds and all the other things that they have, that they really are under different allowances than any other use with respect to ESHA or other boundaries. Sometimes we had some input about some really specific things that some different owners were interested in. And of course, that's really helpful. But at the policy level, we're trying to generalize that a little bit and then hold those details for zoning. But that said, we want to be reassuring to the landowners that we're maintaining a record of their input and trying to find a roadmap to getting them what they really need, provided that it is within what the Planning Commission is interested in, and then as it goes forward. So we're noting, because of that new open space for conservation designation, that one of the largest open space areas, which is up the hill behind Nurseryman's Exchange, would no longer be open space reserve. It really needs to go into that conservation designation. And that area is really, really different than all of the urban reserve and other open space reserve areas. It's not in active ag use. It's steep. It's heavily vegetated. It's in the high fire hazard zone. And so by already taking that out of the open space reserve picture, which is already in your draft plan that way, we did note that the remaining open space reserve properties are pretty similar to the urban reserve properties in terms of what's going on them. They have an array of different ag or ag compatible uses, usually with a house and some outbuildings and supporting structures. Now they are on the edges of town, which was something that differentiated urban reserve parcels from open space reserve parcels. And so we need to note that that's in your certified LCP as one of the defining factors between them. And we may hear more from our property owners about what we really should be thinking about in terms of differentiating them. But the Coastal Commission staff was interested in whether or not we could combine them into one. And from staff's perspective, as long as that was, of course, amenable to the Planning Commission, and that all of those things that I just talked about in terms of supportive uses, all the details you've seen, the farm to table, the events, agritourism, et cetera, are provided, as in particular they were written for urban reserve, would be applied to all of them. So also that priority housing overlay would be retained for those properties and those uses, similar to what you already have in this draft document, where a number of those properties actually we haven't even figured out exactly where that needs to go, but we can talk about that more. So we know we're going to get comments on that. One of the comments we've already had is just we're really worried about the name, and we were brainstorming. We were real clear when we presented this 2 weeks ago that this was just us working really hard to respond to the Coastal Commission and come up with an approach. And if the name is not good, that's okay. The intent, though, we hope is clear, and that's what we want to get feedback about tonight. One other way to possibly deal with this is to not have a reserve designation and to not put them in PD, and to not demand they be ag. We wanted ag to be a voluntary change. If there's somebody with ag use who wants an ag designation, and that's the way your draft is set up now, they can request it. But there could be another designation that's not reserved. It's about ag with some residential, and we've done some thinking about how to do that. So if it's really about a placeholder, we could do some study of that for you and bring that back. But we need input, and I know we've got some property owners in the room, so that will be really helpful tonight. Let's see here. I think that wraps up what I wanted to say about that. Brittany's got the 5th topic, and it's short, and we're almost done.
Okay, last but not least, the Coastal Commission staff letter suggested simplifying our ESHA policies, specifically the ESHA buffer policies, to allow a little more flexibility for site-specific, project-by-project basis cases where a biological study could provide evidence of the need for a change in the buffer requirements, and that could mean an increase or decrease depending on the site-specific conditions. So the Coastal Commission staff provided several examples from other local jurisdictions that get after a little more of what they were looking for. Pacific Grove and Morro Bay were both draft uncertified policy language. Just wanted to make that clear. Pacific Grove has a much smaller coastal zone area within its jurisdiction. But Morro Bay is a little more similar to Half Moon Bay in that it's almost entirely within the coastal zone. So those are good examples to look at. And Marin County is a certified land use plan from 2017, I believe. So the example provided from the Coastal Commission staff has been certified from the Coastal Commission and is a little more in line with what they're asking us to do in our land use plan. So just a couple considerations on your staff's end was that we want to make sure there's specific requirements established for what type of evidence we'd be looking for in a biological assessment that would allow that adjustment to be made in a buffer requirement, and to make sure that we have those minimums established to ensure a adequate level of protection for ESHA, no matter what. And that concludes our presentation. We will take it back to the Planning Commission for clarifying questions.
Thank you very much. I have a number of speaker cards here, but are there any clarifying questions from the commission at this point? Commissioner Benjamin.
So it might make more sense to wait, so I'll ask it, and if you think we should wait, that's fine too. In the list of policies that were highlighted green or yellow, you know, I understood existentially that yellow meant we could probably turn it into something actionable that would fit into the confines of the LCP. And I was sort of struggling to instantiate a couple of them. And there were a lot of them, so I don't want to blow by blow go through them. But I thought maybe one or two might be worth just sort of seeing if there's an illustration. It may be that that's premature and that staff's thinking about it right now as kind of existential, but we don't have a specific idea. I don't want to put anybody on the spot.
So maybe we table that for discussion.
Fine.
Yeah.
That's fine.
Any other questions at this point? Open it up for public comments. Okay. We'll open up for public comments. First speaker, Casey Branscombe. Is the green light on your?
go.
Thank you.
Thank you, commissioners, for giving me the opportunity to speak. I've come to every meeting. I've spent, last meeting I watched on TV, to be fair, but I've been here for every other meeting, all the study sessions. I have gone page by page, letter by letter through every draft, had multiple meetings with Jill and Brittany, and I do want to say that I believe their heart is in the right place and their intent is positive. I own 5 parcels, 76 acres in urban reserve. I think all of you know me, Branscombe Farm. I've been here for 15 years, trying to run my horse breeding business and take care of my 11 employees. And I really had hoped in this new plan that I could believe that you actually wanted Branscombe Farms to continue in Half Moon Bay and be able to economically survive. And I have to say, quite honestly, when I bought the property in 2004 from the McClellans, I was given a box like this. And they said, the future value of this property is in table 9.1 of the coastal plan. And Urban Reserve, in this huge box, had all the testimony and all of the agreements that were made and the documentation of the future residential value of the property, which surrounds Sea Haven. The roads go straight to it, the water, the sewer, everything. And there were all kinds of promises made. I realized that was then, and this is now. And I don't have any interest in seeing Sea Haven expand to the size of Branscombe Farms. But I do have an interest in preserving the value of my property, of having a legacy for my family, of not seeing you just take what is clearly in the current plan and is clearly articulated and quantified as to the exact number of residential units that my property is supposed to be able to eventually support and would be supported. And I just, you know, I try really hard to see how through all of these plans and this new agricultural land use and, you know, thousands of policies, it seems like, I try to fit some vision of Branscombe Farms that can be economically sustained, that can work. And I just can't get it. I really can't. So I'm coming at it a different way now. If you want my property as a park, if you want it as an open space, if you want it as some kind of visual corridor or a conservation festival for dusky-footed wood rats or whatever it is that you're looking for in the town, fine. Come buy it. Come just put, you know, I think, you know, when you get to this, it's like speak truth to power. Uncle, I'm ready. I am ready to give up. So what I would say is, in this circumstance, I just look at, you know, what do I do in this case? So I go to my you know, little research, and I say, I go to Google, and I read the Fifth Amendment of the Constitution, which says, no person shall be deprived of private property without due process, nor shall private property be taken for public use without just compensation. And then the next thing I Googled was, when is a downzoning or a reduction in land use, you know, considered or taking away of something that had been promised? You know, when is that deserving of compensation? You know, when is that unfair or unjust? And it turns out there's a website called CaliforniaEminentDomain.com. Who knew? Anyway, it just says that the owner is entitled to compensation if the owner, you know, spent sums of money in good faith reliance on a document that says, you know, this is what the land is supposed to be worth. And if, for example, if the change in zoning can be sown as a subterfuge to reduce the acquisition price, or if the change in zoning was meant to accomplish the same purpose of the acquisition of the land, i.e. for open public open space. So if you really want it as public open space, come on, Committee for Green Foothills or Post or whoever you are. I'm available. You can see my tax return anytime. Branscombe Farms is a marginal business, does about $1.2 million a year, and it costs about that much to run it in this city. So what I had hoped is that you'd actually give me uses that would allow me to stay here, you know, to put my employees in houses. I mean, all you have to do is read any one of, on September 13th, I submitted as detailed a list in response to all the policies that says, here's how you can make it work if you're actually serious about having Branscombe Farms stay in Half Moon Bay and continue to try and do a good job and be a good citizen in the community. So thank you. I'm sorry, I might have taken more than my 3 minutes, but thank you for listening.
Thank you very much. Our next speaker, Lennie Roberts. Sorry, they're just as they come up.
Okay. Well, I wasn't ready to. That it's a little hard. That's a hard act to follow. So I have submitted comments, and I really appreciate the staff's quick response and summary of the comments. What would I like to say about that? And I assume you all got our comments too. So, and I appreciate the responsiveness of several of our requests. I guess with regarding the PDs that are proposed to be redesignated, I hope that the staff is going to be working closely with Coastal Commission staff, because I'm not sure that their intent has been necessarily what you might have received it as. I've had a discussion. I think that certainly the ability to designate certain PDs as completed, essentially completed, is not in question. The question is how, if you try to redesignate some of those PDs, there will maybe unintended consequences because of the complexities of the history of that particular PD, and the need to sort of keep those complexities and history and restrictions or agreements that might get lost through a redesignation. So I think that's sort of an overarching concern that we have, that sort of triggered some of our specific comments. Yeah, we also, I would just to add one more thing, the ESHA buffer language, we are concerned that the current approach may not be that workable. So I think you should continue to discuss with the Coastal Commission staff, and we also urge you to look at the appeals court ruling about vernally wet areas, which was part of the appeal court decision on Beechwood. And then resource dependent use definition. There are some definitions there. I don't believe that some of the uses that are examples that would be allowable in as a resource dependent use are not really eligible for that. So thank you for considering my comments.
Thank you very much. Next speaker, Bruce Russell.
I guess that's on. I'd like to address the issue of redesignating and ultimately rezoning Ocean Colony. I really can't comment on the other PDs like Pacific Ridge because I'm not that familiar with the history. But I am familiar with the fact that Ocean Colony is a really complex PUD. There are 24 subdivisions in Ocean Colony. There's a hotel, there's townhouses, condominiums, a golf course, offices, clubhouse, retail, parking lots. And although this might just be about a general plan or a land use designation, that just begs the question, because sooner or later you're going to have to rezone those things once you redesignate them. First of all, your designations in your general plan need to be consistent with your zoning. And sooner or later, if you're going to rezone these, you're going to have to do another LCP, because those will be implementing ordinances. And you don't have any zones that can cover all of these different uses in Ocean Colony. For example, of the 24 subdivisions, in the single-family houses, you have different setbacks, different height restrictions, different envelopes, all kinds of different lot sizes that developed over a course of 45 years. You would have to, none of your existing ordinances will cover all those different uses. So what you're going to have to do, just in terms of R1 zoning, you'd have to address 3 or 4 different site setbacks, different lot sizes. Ocean Colony, much of it was built with 32-foot height limits, so that would have to be addressed, or you'd create a bunch of non-conforming uses sooner or later. But the real reason that I wanted to speak was I don't understand the reason for it. Ocean Colony is 99% built out. It has functioned for 45 years. There has never been a major piece of litigation. There has never been a major contentious development within the community. There has never been really a lot of disputes between the PUD that was approved in 1973 that laid out the uses, the density, the geographic areas, and that the project has been developed consistent with that approved and certified plan development plan. You have a lot of work to do on this LUP. I just don't understand taking on the issue of redesignating now and then having to rezone a really complex multi-use project that's basically fundamentally built out and has never caused any problems. It seems to me that it might be a better use of staff time and city resources to focus on much more difficult and complex issues than a problem that doesn't exist and will create a lot of difficult situations. Let me just give one final example. The Spyglass subdivision, 50 units, was built with 10-foot setbacks and 9,500 square foot lots. You don't have a residential zone that requires that. So if you were to impose an R1 zone at 6-foot setbacks and 7,500 square feet, does that mean those units could now be expanded? The FARs could be increased because they're now functioning under a much more liberal zoning, or you'd have to create a new zone, for example, that would regulate what was regulated by the planned unit development plan that was submitted for that subdivision. Those kinds of problems exist on 20 to 25 subdivisions and a lot of commercial uses, and I just don't understand the reason for it. I appreciate that the Coastal Commission often gives the city advice, and usually really good advice. I think they missed the boat here. I don't think they understand the complexity of this unique PUD, and that's why it's called a planned unit development, because it required at every phase for the city to approve the planned unit components. And I think it's worked pretty well. Thank you.
Thank you. Next speaker, John Callan.
Good evening. Thank you very much for all your patience. I'm going to be very brief, and I'm going to skip around a little bit, but I think in light of the times I've appeared before this group that you're fairly aware of my concerns. I'm a little in the dark because I also wrote a letter. I haven't gotten a response yet that was somewhat detailed, that outlined the nature of my concerns with the various plans and projects that we have. I'm excited with the idea that the Coastal Commission has come across in looking at the zoning. I think the PUD zoning has frustrated development on your coastline for a long time now. But I haven't seen any of the Coastal Commission comments. I'd like to get a copy of those or know where I could find those. It would be exciting for us if they had finally rezoned the property in line with the Wavecrest redevelopment plan that was approved by the city, approved by the California Coastal Commission, and approved by the California Conservancy. and gotten away from the PUD zoning. I'm a little in the dark too, because some of the language used in here I'm unfamiliar with, which seems odd, only because I've been coming to these meetings since 1973. So you have in here a PD called the Wave Crest Arroyo. I don't know what that is. I know what Smithfield Park is. I know Post 80 acres. I know the CLT 50 acres. I also know that the North Wave Crest consumes about 495 acres. So I don't know what happened to all the other acres. I'd like to know. I mean, we have about 350 parcels here on the coast side, and we're concerned with the development of those properties, and it seems like as though somehow they've been lost in the shuffle. I see in here where you're talking about Dolores, Upper Grandview. I don't know if Upper Grandview means east of Golden Gate Avenue. I don't know what Upper Grandview means. And Glen Cree PD. Well, that's 1, 2, 3 PDs. And then you go on to say that 2 PDs will not be brought forward in the final draft. And I don't know if, and with a little more specificity, I don't precisely understand what Dolores means. And we use that language here, and we talk about Dolores. Well, I know Dolores, I know Van Ness, I know all these streets pretty well, Occidental. But I don't know what you mean when you say Dolores. So it's confusing to me. I guess I'm in the dark. I guess I'm in the dark for a few reasons. I guess I'm in the dark because some of this language doesn't jive. You've got a lot of new nomenclature on here, and you got a bunch of acres missing. I have a sinking suspicion I know who's belongs to them. And I hope that we're still using Redondo Beach Road as an access point. I hope we're still doing that. Thank you very much for your time and trouble, gentlemen.
Thank you.
And ladies.
Jill, correct me if I'm wrong, but the Coastal Commission comment letter that was included in the board pack or the commission packet for the last meeting, is that correct?
That's right, and it's on the website, and we're happy to provide it. It is there. You have to scroll all the way down to the last page.
It's being moved to the very
And she's
beginning
going to
of the
move it
agenda.
up. We understand people can't find it, but it was posted the day that we received it and put our response together. So, but we'll make sure that Mr. Kellen has a copy of that. We don't have a significant amount of written communication from the Coastal Commission, so we can talk about that later. We have responses to a lot of the comments that we're hearing tonight, and we do hope we get a chance to address them because we think it will help folks with the document.
Okay, and I know we've also seen a pretty clear summary of the different PUDs and maps, and I'm assuming that's on the Plan HMB website as well. Next speaker, Terry Andreotti.
Hi, I'm Terry Andreotti at 227 Kelly Avenue, farm on Kelly. We've been there 93 years. My concerns are ag tourism. I'd like to be included in maybe some of your decision making on some of the things that like we would like to do on the properties that would encourage us to keep doing what we're doing there. I know we wanted to do cooking seminars, and I do right now. I work with the kids and talk about the history of Half Moon Bay and how we started, and we talk about conservation on water and where we get our water and what grows great and how to plant and stuff. But there's other things that we wanted to do on our farm that we talked with Jill with. But again, we need farm labor housing on our property as one thing, and we already worked with the Post to designate, I think, 5 acres for a farm center right off Kelly Avenue, and I was wondering if we could be included in your, like I said before, in your decision making before you finalize everything, and that's why I'm here. And thanks for letting me talk.
Great, thank you very much. Carrie Burke.
Good evening, Carrie Burke, 332 Princeton Avenue, Half Moon Bay. Thank you for this opportunity. I'll touch on some of the topics and related ones to the Coastal Commission's response and the staff report. I have always held the concern about how the general plan and the local coastal land use plan are going to be integrated. So I think that it's very important that we have a legally defensible document that's very clear. We don't need another dilapidating lawsuit dealing with land use issues. So some clarity in that area of saying what are actually general plan policies and what are local coastal plan policies would be very good. I think it is interesting to consider removing the reserve designation. I think it was very subjective in the existing policies because terms like economically feasible test or urban reserves, urban uses that have been substantially developed, that's very hard to quantify. So changing or losing the reserve designation, I think, would be a great benefit. And even talking about renaming the rural reserve to rural coast, that might be another terminology that might work rather than the reserve. And I think that these people in those designations really deserve an answer of how they can use it, and I think some flexibility, and it's been discussed that we need, just in how we're approaching agriculture, ag tourism, the housing, all these are related in how you can keep viability and sustainability going, and so those have to be considered for these designations. I also shared the concern about the reference in the staff report regarding North Wave Crest and the table. It really wasn't clear exactly that there were missing parcels and that we would need to understand what could be achieved on those missing parcels. And a concern that perhaps on Redondo Beach on the south side, that's an area that has development on 3 sides, and that should be considered potentially for development because rather than encroaching on areas that aren't developed, that here you have roads and development on 3 sides and really should consider that. I also am concerned that we really look carefully at policy 2.78 regarding the need for master planning. That was it from our original general plan or local coastal plan about planning the parcels in the PD as a whole, and it's really time to see how this can be in a timely manner so that individual property owners can have some realistic idea of what they can do with their property with our new plan. So, and also, just in closing, what Jill mentioned, the large open space parcel above Nurseryman's, that's the only open space parcel we have that's conforming to the standard. So I think by then redesignating the other ones, that would really be useful. And so I do support taking a look at that. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And the last speaker's card I have is for Mike Ferreira.
Good evening, Chair Holt, commissioners and staff. I'll start with a real quick question. I hope there's a quick answer. Mariucci, when you talked about 2 per, were you talking about the main house and an ADU? Or were we talking about 2 main houses and 2 ADUs?
I think we can respond. Why don't you just keep speaking so we don't eat it?
All right. Pacific Ridge. There's a very complicated and important settlement agreement, court-ordered settlement agreement between 3 parties, the city, the developer, and the Coastal Commission, that has a lot of performance things in it, not all of which have been completed, and one of which is lot retirement ordinance, 15 years. An ordinance, not just a policy, an ordinance. There's a significant amount of money that comes out of there for that. The place isn't built out yet. If it gets finished and everything gets done, including the stoplight, et cetera, then, okay, maybe that's when we should look at changing anything there. But right now, there's this nice big agreement that's a wrap. That was very hard negotiation to get there. And so I would caution that a little patience before we mess with that would be a good idea. I can't one-up Bruce Russell on very many things, or I won't even try. Ocean Colony has one other unique feature, very narrow streets with sidewalks on one side, and a prohibition on nighttime parking. I mean, it would be great if we could do that in the rest of the city, but they can do it, so they don't need our help. Let's just leave them alone. That's a great thing. South Wavecrest, I just would like to add that there's 12 affordable units over by Joe's Restaurant, where Bruce has his offices. That's part of South Wavecrest. That was part of the redevelopment affordable units that were required. We just need to remember that when we go down there. Lot retirement is a traffic mitigation policy based on findings by the Coastal Commission. The idea behind it is not stopping growth, et cetera, et cetera. It's traffic mitigation. In other words, the commission has agreed to a certain amount of lots to fit our highways, and they don't want new lots. All right? So I understand the heart that's behind the idea that we should exempt affordable housing as is written here in the draft policy, but that's not math, okay? Traffic mitigation is math. I got a lot more, but I'm going to have to quit now, okay? Next time.
We always welcome comments in writing. Jill, did you want to respond to the question on the Medici?
Yeah, we would like to give this a go here. Brittany's going to check out, and we'll give her, I'll go through all of these, but she's looking for an example or two to respond to Vice Chair Benjamin's question about illustrating how a programmatic policy might be revised to be an actionable policy that would be more in line with what the Coastal Commission staff would like to see, a policy that's really specifically useful for development review. We will make sure everybody has every comment that we've received from the Coastal Commission. That letter, though, that you got at your last meeting, that's really the best thing that we have. Most of our exchanges are conference calls, meetings, and then we do have some email, but it's mostly about when we're going to have the conference call or the meeting. So we're hoping for more comments from them, and we're happy to share any of that. We appreciate that Mr. Callan's letter has not yet been responded to. The reason why we've responded to the comments that we've had over the last two sessions is they're mostly in line with this most recent input that we have from the Coastal Commission. For example, the Committee for Green Foothills comments were almost all about those things that were brought up in that letter. Now, Mr. Callan's letter, along with all the other comment letters we've received, are cataloged. We have them in a table, and we are preparing responses to every comment, and we're trying to have that done for your joint study session on October 29th. So this is not lost, and it's not something we're taking lightly. We have a lot of work to do on this wide variety of input that we've received. There's some confusion about what we were trying to present about Wavecrest, and thank you. Brittany's going to put up that little table. In the draft land use plan update, there is a PD called North Wavecrest that is a different boundary than the existing Wavecrest PD. And we're real specific about how it's changed. It describes what it is in the certified LCP and what is proposed to be the new boundary. And what we're showing here are the pieces of those 4 bullet points are pieces that are in the Wavecrest PD area now that we proposed, and it's already documented in the draft document. It's been out for public consumption since December, that those 4 pieces would no longer be part of that PD. And the reason is that their ownership and the intended use for those parcels has changed since your LCP was certified. So specifically, the Coastside Land Trust 50 acres, we're proposing that it be in a conservation designation because that's what they are trying to do with that land. The Post, 80 acres, our understanding is that it's in agricultural use, and the open space reserve designation could work, although we are also talking about what else to do with that designation, and we are going to talk to Post about their intended long-term use of that property for ag. They lease it to a farmer who has been working that. Smithfield is obviously a active city park, and the Wavecrest Arroyo is the term that we're using kind of colloquially because it is a piece of property that was, it's large, it is an arroyo, it is in that Wavecrest area, it was bought by Post, and it will be, my understanding is it's going to be conveyed, our Coastside Land Trust is going to buy it in turn. So the intended outcome for the Wavecrest Arroyo, which is, I think no one in the room could imagine it being developed. It's very steep, it's fully incised, it's vegetated, it's really tricky, would to be in the open space for conservation area. So that's a lot of acreage, and that's why the land area for that PD is different. There's no properties are missing. What's left is the acreage that was presented in the draft plan update. So we're not, we just want to be clear about where they went and what Brittany was presenting. The remainder is what is still included in the draft plan, and we'll make sure that anyone who's interested in this has a chance to meet with staff, and we'll review the diagrams again. Of course, those are in the draft chapter 2. It's on the planhmb.org website. It's on the first page of that website. You just need to scroll down and click into chapter 2. I hope that helped. Dolores, what's Dolores? Dolores was an idea that we had about trying to have a PD in the Bernardo Station area to see if that might be suitable as a TDR, a transfer of development rights, receiving site, as well as a kind of a modest to low density mixed use area, considering some of the existing land uses that are already there. Child care center, a couple churches, and a little bit of residential development. It did not get wheels. We got feedback that folks weren't really delighted with it. We noticed that it is wetter than we thought it was, and we also have been getting a lot of phone calls about doing things that are really relevant to this rural residential designation that we've been talking about. Specifically, a few things that involve horses and dogs and things like that. So we're tooling back and agreeing not to force this. This was a draft, and it was something we tried along with that Upper Grandview Glen Creek PD. And if the question is, where is that? Again, there is a diagram and a description of where this is in the draft plan. The boundaries of every PD are delineated in each area. So I think that's some of these. Let's talk about, I'm going to do the lot retirement, and then we'll talk about Matucci. Yes, we understand that lot retirement from the Coastal Commission perspective, and as well as ours from their guidance, was really to address the cumulative impacts of development. So having the concept of if you create a lot, one is retired, If you think about it over a really long period of a planning horizon, that could suffice to support maintaining the threshold of development that an existing subdivided community might have. Now, we proposed a lot retirement policy in this document that had allowances for affordable housing in particular to not be subject to it, and this was really being responsive to City Council's priority for affordable housing. We also pitched some ideas about being inside the town center versus outside the town center. We understand that if any property is exempt from, any lot creation is exempt from lot retirement, we might not end up addressing the cumulative impacts in that manner. Now, what we really are happy to have is that this is the first time we've had really concrete input about the language in that lot retirement policy at the podium. I think we have some written comments about it. We would like the commission to think about that and give us some more direction on it, but one thing to keep in mind is the town center construct that is really strong in your plan and is the intent that council has and that you've had. Trip generation rates for development in the town center are going to be lower because of the type of housing that is proposed, being multifamily and being located in the area that it is. It's not going to be as low as it would be if it was on a transit station in another town. We don't have that tool, but it will be lower. And so your staff would continue to really encourage exempting affordable housing from it. Most affordable housing comes in rental and would actually not have a subdivision, so it might not even be subject to the lot retirement policy anyway. So there's a lot to it, and we're happy to talk about it. We've thought about this quite a bit with our attorneys, with our housing consultant, staff, and we're just really glad to get some feedback about it tonight. The Matucci, I saved that for last because I want to be really clear about what I said. The density that we're referring to is not per lot. It's this was 2 units to the acre, which is the maximum density of the existing land use designation. The low density land use designation that you have on the books now covers a range between 0 and 2 dwelling units per acre. So it's not about how many units per lot. Each lot that conforms to that, which in our opinion are the lots that are already created there, can have a house, and that PD actually also allows ADUs. So we're talking a main residence and an ADU for the developed side of that PD, which is the east side that fronts on Jenna Lane. So we can dig into it more, but it's a different unit of measure than what you heard at the podium, and I just hope everybody understands the difference between units per lot and units per acre and what we're proposing. We'd want a zoning designation that would require a minimum lot size that is large enough so that some of these large lots could not subdivide into more lots. So that's part of the thinking with that, because we understand this one is done. This was planned. It had a PUD plan, and that subdivision conforms to it, and it is the city's intent to maintain that as it was approved. I'm going to flip it back to Brittany, and she can talk about an actionable policy. All right.
Thank you. So I'm looking at attachment 1, the preliminary list of programmatic policies that staff put together with the green and yellow highlights. I'm going to look at policy 6-156 on page 6 of the attachment as an example of where we could be more actionable. This might not need to establish a program. We could just retrofit, relocate, or eliminate ocean outfalls and get.
Excuse me, I live close to this and I want to, thinking maybe I need to skate.
Yes, thank you.
We'll get another one.
No.
No.
She has it.
No, we will get another one.
I apologize.
That's okay.
No,
We
my fault.
appreciate.
Thank you.
I could pick one. You want to shag a fly ball? How about policy, let's see, was 615 in yellow or was that green? 615 was green. Oh, so I had a different comment about that one. I didn't. How about 110? Was that? Yeah, let's look at 110. So I could imagine, yeah, so this is on page 5, yeah, 6-110. So I could imagine striking pursue strategies 2 and beginning with protect. And so we could evaluate development in terms of whether it achieves that. You know, but you may have a completely different way of thinking about how to make it actionable. And
No, you are absolutely in line with our thinking. That would make it more actionable and more applicable to development review.
So things like that. Okay. Okay. So I can provide detailed comments supporting that way of thinking now that I know what you have in mind. Thank you.
Thank you.
Anything else from staff? We'll close the public hearing. Thank you. Before I bring it back to the commission, just checking in. Does anybody want a break or need a break? Okay, we're going to break for 5 minutes. Just outreach and discussion. So with that, who wants to get us started here? Commissioner Hernandez.
Great summary, great comments. Thank you for the color-coded documents. They make life a lot easier. I think some interesting comments here. I do think the concerns raised around Pacific Ridge and Ocean Colony in particular require some careful consideration. I don't think the comments from the Coastal Commission were meant to obviate the long, rich history of litigation and development that have happened over the last 45 years. So I think those things need to just be taken carefully into consideration. I do think the tiered concept of urban reserve exists for a reason. It was meant to deprioritize development in those areas. That said, I do think it's a smart idea to have some flexibility with agricultural uses on those types of properties so that they are sustainable. And those are my comments.
Commissioner Benjamin?
Vice Chair. So I apologize for having a lot of comments, but this is, it's a good document, and I think that you are soliciting them. So I think we got a lot of helpful comments this evening, and in writing, I want to thank the writers and the speakers for weighing in tonight. I was part of the GPAC that proposed the open space conservation land use designation, and the goal that we had envisioned was for lands that we were done with, that we had clarity that the goal was to preserve them because they had valuable habitat, or that they had hazards and it wasn't safe to be on them. We certainly did not envision, as a side effect of that designation, doing something that would affect a pre-existing agreement of some kind, that would limit the applicability of, let's say, a deed restriction or some other established precedent. So one possibility, and I'll just throw it out there, is that maybe the language of a designation, whenever we get around to writing it, could specifically roll in, those terms, if not explicitly, implicitly say, if there's this existing agreement, that we're not intending to stomp on that. If there's already some agreement that says the land is going to be used for this and it's not going to be used for that, difficult to see exactly how that works in some cases, but it's food for thought. I'm not advocating it, just putting it out as an idea. There are a number of more recent laws that have passed or not passed that I think have the potential to impact our LCP update thinking. And I realize that we can't constantly be evolving because the laws are going to constantly evolve, and we have to put a stake in the ground somewhere and say, this is what we're aiming for. That said, there were just a whole bunch of fire protection laws that were signed into law by Governor Newsom. And I think it's important for us, as we go into this, to understand what, if any, ramifications those have for the way that we're asking our public to develop, to make sure that we aren't creating a space where we're getting the protections that we think we have for habitats or evolution from hazards isn't going to be obviated by statute. Similarly, there was a veto of SB1, unexpected by some. As I understand it, part of SB1 was a bit of a, I'll use the term firewall for lack of a better word, that if there were rollbacks to the U.S. Endangered Species Act, that the SB1 would fill that gap. And in general, for protection of coastal resources, we have the Coastal Act, we have, you know, the State Endangered Species Act and the Clean Water Act, actually the more recently strengthened version of that, and other laws. But to the extent that SB 1 doesn't take effect, I want to be sure that I understand what our firewall really is. For our community has expressed the values that they value coastal resources, and that's part of the reason they like to live here. So I want to be sure that we're facilitating that. That said, I'd like to go to some of the specific policy questions, some of which were raised tonight, some of which actually came up at the last meeting, and you asked us to think about them. One of those was a proposal that came forward for us to, it sort of was just floated, was the idea that perhaps there would be some kind of housing opportunity out at the end of Grove. It was the Magnolia. It was the county. There was a piece of land that the county thought might be interesting to do some housing in that area. And I wanted to think about it before I responded, and I've thought about it, and I want to speak to it tonight. I understand that workforce housing, as it was conceived and developed here, provided for state beach employees or school district employees who are working here, who need a place to live in order to avoid, adding to our commute. I don't know what the county employee location is. Maybe there is one and I'm just not aware of it. But I believe that that location is pretty far west. And I don't know what the existing designation of that land is, whether it's part of whether it's in an area that's zoned already for housing, or whether it's in a PD and would be changed as part of this. But while I was thinking about it, I noticed that in some of the other areas where we're proposing workforce housing, I see some pros and cons. I think that the housing value itself is great. I've really warmed up to the idea. I was initially a little bit skeptical. At the same time, I've noticed that some of the institutions seem to be taking pre-development liberties before there actually has been approvals. I've seen some fire breaks that are wider than I thought when they were adjacent to habitat. The habitat disappears. I've noticed a bit of fill that was dumped on a property. I don't remember, maybe there was a permit for it. It's quite possible. But I just want to be sure that whether we're talking about a school or the state beach or a church or anybody else who's going to get these kind of things, that we have set the expectations and we are enforcing the expectation that they're going to toe the same lines that we expect our private developers to toe, that they're going to provide the same amenities, that they're going to provide the same protections. And I don't know enough about that area near Magnolia that's proposed, but I need to know more about it. And I believe that Commissioner Hernandez expressed some interest in that, so I'm willing to have a dialogue about it, but I'm unclear on some of these details, and I'd like to get smarter about that. With respect to North Wavecrest, I am a bit unclear about the areas that are, I believe I know the areas that were designated for open space. I think we've got it up on the page conveniently. And I think it would be helpful to have a map in front of us at the same time that says these are the parts of what is existing North Wavecrest that's not that. And this is what we're going to plan for that. I think that might be a helpful way for people to think about the potential use. I'd like to talk about buffers briefly. And I suspect others will have feelings about this, but briefly I want to say that the size of a buffer in the staff report suggested that it might be different if it was in an area that was sort of near urban development as opposed to in some area that was further from urban development. And my reading of the Coastal Act is that the buffer zone needs to be sufficient to protect the resource. And it doesn't really matter whether that resource is downtown or that resource is at the edge of town. You still get to protect the resource. The buffer has to preserve the biological productivity. And I really worry about the language in some of the alternate text that talked about being able to reduce the size of the buffer. My case studies for our town are Pacific Ridge and North Wavecrest, where we had some epic fights where someone hired a biologist who, you know, it's not hard to find a biologist who will who somehow manages to tell you what you need to hear. And in this case, that resulted in some very substantial litigation. I think if our standards were that we had buffers of a minimum fixed size, we can debate about what that might be, but not that they can get adjusted downward. I think that gives meaning to the term minimum buffer. So I do worry about that downward adjustment feature. I understand that buffers are not easy, especially in areas that have already been developed. But if there's a hazard or a habitat that's different on one lot than on another lot, our requirement is to protect the habitat or to avoid the hazard. And I don't think that in the case of buffers, that saying it has to look like the other one is an adequate basis for saying we've protected the resource. I don't think it meets the standard of the Coastal Act. We had a conversation about resource-dependent uses, and one of the questions that staff asked was whether camping would be a resource-dependent use. And I puzzled over that for a while this week. And the way I thought about it was, well, you know, if a resource-dependent use requires the physical resource, you know, sand mining is a resource-dependent use. It's not a permitted one, right? You can't do it where you don't have sand, but it's a resource-dependent use, even if we don't allow it here. I'm not sure what the specific resource is that camping requires. So my comment is not that camping is good or bad. It's that I don't see what the quality is that makes it a resource-dependent use. So I'm open to hearing more about that. I appreciated the inclusion of the Venice PUD changes that were brought forward to us from you or through you from the Coastal Commission. In the comment section of that, I realize now that while we talked about some of the resource values on that land, we talked about the biological assessment. There was a section of that biological assessment that referred to some of the soils as poorly drained, which, you know, may or may not be a wetland, but I think it's worth noting that the reports reference poorly drained soils in this area, and there probably needs to be some assessment of that beyond how we can drain them. Why don't I take a stop here and reload later? I'll let someone else take a look. I've taken enough airtime for now. I'll reload.
Commissioner Reddick.
Thanks. This is a bit tangential, but excuse me, I'm trying to read the map that you have up there, Brittany, and I think North Wavecrest is now divided by the Arroyo, which is in light blue. That makes sense.
Yes, you can see the Wavecrest Arroyo in the blue stripe here that it covers two parcels. Whoa, whoa. two parcels that are owned by Post that are proposed for open space for conservation. And North Wavecrest is now on either side of that arroyo as proposed.
Yeah, thank you for that. I wanted to echo what, well, thanks to staff, of course, again, as always, for all your hard work and diligently working with Coastal Commission staff. I'm sure that can be an arduous process, but it's going to be very valuable for us to decipher what they really care about and do a good job at that when the time comes to finally get the plan approved. So thank you, and please keep up the good work. And thank you for all the public comments, of course. Always appreciated. I wanted to echo what Commissioner Hernandez said about, trying to find a balance between the Coastal Commission staff interest in seeing us embrace brevity in many ways in the plan as far as the PDs go, as far as the land usages go. But I also thought that Mr. Russell and Mr. Ferreira had been pretty articulate about the histories behind Ocean Colony and Pacific Ridge, and it does raise the question of the Einstein quote, which Vice Chair Benjamin has a few times quoted to me, that Einstein said things should be as simple as possible, but no simpler. So maybe we do need to do extra diligence to make sure that nothing important would be lost as far as those two communities go with the kinds of changes that we're contemplating. I liked some aspects of the buffer policies that the staff shared for Pacific Grove and Morro Bay. They had I'm not sure they're perfect in every way as far as Half Moon Bay is concerned, but they had a lot of consistency, they had a lot of clarity. They were pretty parallel in terms of what they require for biological site assessments. I noticed that Morro Bay included explicitly the concept of a qualified biologist approved by the city, and of course Half Moon Bay needs to continue to move in that direction. Morro Bay also had an interesting thing about if there's impact on monarch butterfly overwintering rookery areas, that be done at the seasonally correct time, that the monitoring of that be done at the right season. So I'd like to see us embrace that kind of approach as well. Jimmy, that county land at the end of Magnolia, there's a small house that a county employee has lived in for a long time with a very large fenced yard. So I don't know if the fence defines the county property exactly, but you could imagine with fairly low impact some additional residences there perhaps. So I think for me 2 weeks ago, that's one thing that made that appealing. I think that's all I have for the moment.
Commissioner Polgar?
All right. Well, I think I might be a little all over the map because it's perhaps how I'm feeling tonight. But I really appreciate all of the synthesis that staff has done on there were conversations with the Coastal Commission and responding to the more recent comments, and I'm looking forward to seeing the responses to the other letters and comments that have come in. I wanted to echo a couple things just that fellow commissioners have points they've made. I also I think I heard the comment or the suggestion of patience when it comes to like Pacific Ridge, and I agree also with the comment of why to redesignate the Ocean Colony. I think that that's a lot of work that's not a good use of our time, and so just feel that those are perhaps not a priority or a good idea, frankly. I also was a little concerned while I, in general, am very supportive of the simplifying the ESHA buffers policies, I agree that it appeared that, I think of the examples given, like the Marin, I think it was the Marin policies maybe seemed most aligned with what would be appropriate for us. I think it was the Marin. I was a little concerned also about the language in the, I think it was in maybe the staff report about different types of, that if there's within the urban areas having the buffers. I think that's a slippery slope, because the point is that you're establishing a minimum and then you are using evaluation of the site, the specific site conditions if you want to have some sort of variance from that. And in some cases it may be that it's necessary because the reality is that the habitat is just bigger or extends in further. So I also think that it is, the devil is in the details when it comes to, if that's the approach, the assessment, and I think that Commissioner Ruddock touched upon this with pointing out that if you're going to do an assessment of a certain species and their use of a habitat, it has to be during the right season. And so then you kind of go down a path where you need to make sure we have a rigorous review and assessment approach. So I think that that's very necessary. And kind of, I think another thing that, I don't know if anybody else has kind of really talked about it yet, but and maybe I'm just a little, I'm concerned about completely taking out the policies within the PD policies that if, assuming there's these remaining 7, I think, PDs, having essentially no policies for them that are specific to them. Is that, am I correct in my interpretation? So there would be no.
We're stacking up a bunch of responses to all of your discussion, and we can get into that one. There's a quick reaction of, yes, what you saw that was their red line, but we have some more context around that, so keep going.
And I'm sorry, I probably should have asked this as a clarifying question, but I hadn't really kind of realized what it might mean at that point. I wonder how the master planning process would be applied effectively in this case. And I see why you were, I think Brittany was bringing up the need then to be especially careful that all of the policies that would be applied from other sections and chapters are very well clear, and you basically capture every need you have in that master planning process through these other policies. I think that becomes very challenging for implementation. So that's where I see this falling apart a bit, because especially as I'm well into middle age, I find myself struggling to pull all the pieces together, and I could see things falling through the cracks. I'm concerned about how things might be weighted in terms of different policy, application of policies towards the master planning process. Hopefully what I'm saying makes sense, but I'm just seeing this as basically you're having now to take all these pieces that are sprinkled throughout and know that they apply. And while we have a staff, obviously, who will be very familiar with the policy, the revised plan, I could see that over time. I mean, this last one, how long has it been around for? A long time. I'm wondering about implementation and whether that will actually follow through.
Very good. You want to keep on, Jim? Yeah. Go for it. Go ahead, Commissioner Hernandez.
Sure, I'll respond to a couple of things. I actually really strongly support Sarah's position around providing clarity around the planned development districts. I do think it's important that we put some policies in place because, man, there is a lot of detail spread throughout this document, and there are some standards we expect of some of these areas. So I think it's important for us to clarify those. If there are more generalized policies that can be applied across the board at a high level that are clear, that's great. But I think we've thought through some of these areas with a great deal of specificity. I know, having worked on the subcommittee, we thought through a lot of thorny issues there. Just to respond to the idea of jumping the gun, I think I certainly don't support the idea that people should go off and do development on property without properly following the law. We have rules here, and we're supposed to enforce them. So school districts, the county, whoever, does need to comport with the law. And the Grove housing thing, you know, it's an area for consideration. I mean, it's a beautiful location. It'd be great to be a state park worker who has a house there. My intention is both for the state parks, the county, and especially for the school district, we need to show some flexibility with respect to housing. And we need to help those agencies navigate, because if we don't lean in on this, it's going to be 20 years before we actually come up with a solution. And we'll have missed a whole generation of kids and workers who could benefit from some policies. I also wanted to reiterate something that I forgot, which is the whole point here of a lot of these policies was we want to continue to concentrate development in the town center, and that has been the guidance from this council, is we want to reduce trips, we want to increase density in the downtown and reduce density or maintain density as it exists, you know, within reason outside of the town center. That's the direction we've been given, so that's it.
Okay, Commissioner Benjamin.
Okay, thanks for giving me a chance to reload. I want to talk a minute about, I wanted to acknowledge the comments of Ms. Branscombe. I appreciated her concern, and you know, speaking as an individual member of the commission, you know, and I think working as part of the subcommittee, you know, we thought about our agricultural / horse uses, and it's disappointing to think that what we've come up with might not work. I'd like to understand, and staff probably has, to try to understand what the constraints are, but I certainly want to hear it, because I think particularly when we invested in ancillary uses and we talked specifically about equestrian matters, it seems like I don't know, I thought we tried, and so I'm interested in understanding more. Obviously, I don't want to cross a line over into creating a conflict. I prefer that this get worked out at the staff level if it can, but you know, if there are ideas that we should be floating, I want to hear them. At the last meeting, you invited us to talk about another parcel as a potential agricultural site, and that was Carter Hill, viniculture. And I think one of the challenges on that parcel, well, there are many challenges, we don't have to go into them again, but one of them is entrance and egress. And in the context of agriculture, of course, we've been talking about a lot of ancillary uses. So while our vision might be that it's a place someone goes up to, ties the mines, and comes back down, if we designate it as to do agriculture, that might be farm worker housing, it might be visitors, farm to table, and I think I would be concerned about tapering the ancillary uses to reflect the hazards in an area like that. To me, that it makes me very cautious about seeing an application like that in that location, especially since there are other existing activity, operation on that site, infrastructure kind of activities that I think have the potential to interact well or badly, depending on how that goes. So enough about Carter Hill for now. With respect to the list of green and yellow parcel or policies, one of the challenges here is that, and you know this very well, is that these policies don't exist in isolation. They're part of a larger context. And part of that context is reflected when properly it's noted that there's a policy that's related to this in some other section of the draft LCP, which is good. But there's some policies that where the interaction is subtle, but it is significant. And that's going to take some time to tease out. So I'm not suggesting that staff has done a bad job of it. I don't think there's been enough time for us, any of us, to do a good job of that. And I want to find the time to do that. With respect to specific policies that were mentioned in the green and blue, I wanted to pick just a couple up to illustrate some ideas, and maybe staff can give me a sense for that. So for example, policy 2-72, I think that appeared on page, it was about incompatible uses. So, and because it's in green, the notion here is that it should be moved outside of the LCP and go into a general plan. That's what the green code meant, as opposed to the yellow code that's we reworded. And what I just suggest is there's a facet of this that fits within the Coastal Act. It's about the visitor residential conflicts. It's about the impact of concentrated infrastructure on an existing neighborhood. So I realize that there are parts of it that probably do need to move out, but I just would say let's hesitate and not throw the LCP baby out with the bathwater, and not that it gets thrown out when it goes to the general plan, but you catch my drift. Then in policy 8-3, that was on page 4, I believe. Here we were talking about cultural resources. And again, it's green, so I inferred that we're saying we move that stuff out of the LCP. But the LCP does have sections associated with archaeology and culture. And for example, the Main Street Bridge is protected, as I see it, as a significant piece of cultural resources. The first stressed concrete bridge in San Mateo County, I think it is. And there are probably other structures, the jail and whatnot, that strike me as being, and it may be that there are other policies that already do a great job, and so this is redundant, and that's why it can go. And I realize that talking to Jill about protection of cultural resources is like taking sand to the beach, but I thought it worth taking in there. Then a little further down, there's a policy 2-154. This was an example of the policies that talk about collaboration with other agencies. And I understand that there are lots of these, and I understand why they're seen as programmatic. So that was on at the top of page 5. And the only thing I wanted to comment on this one as an illustration is I think that it was brought over from the existing LCP, maybe. And so my understanding is one of the principles of the LCP is that the new one should be no less protective of coastal resources or facilitating coastal access than the existing LCP. So when viewed through that perspective, I'm not sure which policies should be retained because of their value of being maintaining the levels of protection that are in the existing LCP. And of course, that may not be the best example, but it was one that crossed my mind. Moving to the policies in Chapter 6, so on the same page of these, there's a policy 6-15, which says that we're going to encourage the reporting and verification of special status species sightings in the planning area. And my understanding is that that is very squarely within the natural resource protection requirements of the Coastal Act and should be retained, because we are committed to identifying areas that are habitat. And habitat, I'll just mention parenthetically, while in some cases habitat can be identified by the presence of species at the right time, in many cases habitat has value for species that are metastable. That is, it's habitat that they don't currently occupy, but because the species, in this case the California red-legged frog as an example, has a survival strategy of allowing it to be consumed by a raccoon that does take out in the stream one year, and they come back a later year. So if you look at it right after the drought or after the raccoon's been through, you don't see it, but that doesn't mean that it isn't habitat. So I want to be clear that the survey for some species cannot prove the absence of habitat. It can only confirm the presence of the species. In any event, 615 feels to me like it's in the wrong spot. 699 strikes me, that's the one about priority conservation areas. I agree that it has that very programmatic feel. I see why it's green. It seems to me that if we've done a good job of having a map that identified priority conservation areas, I mean, we know where our natural resources are, but perhaps a map can tell the story in a way that a policy can't. That might be more generalizable, I don't know. The mitigation policy 6100, glad to see that it's yellow. The one thing I would add to that policy, reading it now, after we've had a chance to be away from it for a few months, we probably want to clarify when we say natural resource impacts elsewhere, we don't mean elsewhere within town, we mean out of town. Or potentially there are projects like Caltrans would be doing work on Highway 1 where they get an exemption, but that would require mitigation. So just maybe just tightening up the language a little bit to communicate that. We've talked about policy 110 that was the one that we talked about to illustrate how we make it actionable. Policy 6-151 on page 6 struck me as so it's green, and I think I understand why, but I wanted to test my understanding, which is that if we have policies that preserve the quality of groundwater and maintain the optimum productivity of streams, stuff that we already do in the Coastal Act, maybe a policy that speaks to educating people about that is redundant with respect to Coastal Act purposes. It just means that we have to lean more heavily on those other policies. So the last thing I want to say, policy 776 on the last, 742, the emergency warning system. So I don't know what changes you have in mind to make it programmatic, but I'll just put in my 2 cents that I'm hoping the kinds of improvements would be the things that would allow us to, the public being warned, to distinguish between the kinds of risks. Do I need to move away from the beach because a tsunami's coming, or do I need to get out of the dam inundation zone because the water's coming downhill, or do I need to get out of the way because there's a fire coming my way? And further, that the information system could be more specific in terms of telling us who needs to evacuate, because it's easy to occupy that scarce Highway 1 resource if we panic everybody and everybody gets out of the way. But perhaps you had another idea about what you meant for that policy. And on policy 776, the last page and my last specific comment here, the last sentence of that strikes me as an important thing to retain. This is the idea that we know that we want adequate fire flows and we want to reserve water for adequate fire flows, but we don't want that water to then be the basis for saying, oh yeah, there's plenty of water, let's develop some more. And then once the development's in place, we need more water for more fire flow. So, and I don't think that the intent is to avoid that model, but I think that's one piece of that I hope that we can find a way to retain. The bottom line is that as much as we've been talking about other things, these policies that we're removing, to me, this is the hardest part of what we received tonight. This is the part where I think where the devil is in the details, as Sarah said, that we need to really understand the nuance. And so I know you're doing that. I just want to be sure that we have a chance to catch each other's oversights, and the public has a chance to catch our oversights. They've already done some of that, and I'm grateful for it tonight. But there may need to be some time to chew on this. I want to be sure we have enough time. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much. So I think the intent here was to sort of look at these policies and those that might be able to be provided as more specific, and those that are clearly programmatic and maybe more appropriate in the general plan. So I generally like that approach. I think that's what you're somewhat looking for feedback on, is sort of how we can make it more specific and actionable, and I think that's a good approach. So I think there'll be lots of other opportunities, and there's been lots of wordsmithing that's been done on a lot of the policies, but I think as far as a general approach, I think that's good. I support what a lot of the other commissioners had said around Ocean Colony and Pacific Ridge. I don't think we want to make this more difficult or make other problems, and I think as one of the emails sort of commented, it's sort of a solution looking for a problem, and I think that's something that we want to avoid, and certainly agree with the speaker that there's lots of other challenging issues that we need to deal with, and so we probably don't need to create another one for ourselves. And I would hope that the commission staff would see that. And bless you. Generally support the consolidation, the sort of rural reserve approach. I think that's fine, and I support staff on that. I do want to support what Rick said in terms of our council's direction, and what we've been working towards in the local coastal plan is really emphasizing housing in the downtown corridor, and addressing the question about lot retirement and affordable housing. I do think there's sort of a consideration and value to exempting affordable housing from that, and with that, and looking at just I think traffic and demand on vehicles and the way we work, and a lot of those things have changed and will continue to change. And I think the goal is to really cite affordable housing in that core in a way that minimizes people's need to drive. And so that's certainly the goal, and I hope we can get there. Regarding the question on camping as a resource-dependent use, and I wasn't here for the discussion last time, I do think there's clearly an argument of resources that are dependent for camping to really provide a user experience that makes it desirable, and whether that's scenic resources and some level of natural resources, I think is absolutely resource dependent, and recognizing that our community serves a unique role in the Bay Area as a place that can provide that type of use close to home. I think is important, and really incumbent on us to provide that, as we sort of live in this wired generation. We have a special obligation and unique opportunity to provide a sort of respite from that. So I think to the extent that we can encourage appropriate camping, not necessarily $100,000 RV camping, but appropriate camping, as a resource use, I think is, something to be considered. So with that, I think, staff has done great work all through the part of this project. I know there's been a lot of effort at every stage to really engage with the public and to try to get information out there. And I know you continue to do that, to try to, engage with the community, both on a wide email blast sort of level, as well as lots of phone calls and meetings with individual landowners and other interested stakeholders. So I think, you're commended for that. And I know it's also, you know, frustrating when you feel like you're so close to the finish line and then you get a huge set of comments that make you, you know, start to relook at something. So, and I know we still have a fairly a road ahead of us as well. So with that, thank you very much. And I know you have some things that you want to respond to and next steps. Okay, one more, Commissioner Polgar.
I did want to ask one more thing, that I wanted to understand the process of, with these redesignations of the PD, for instance, with Matucci. So it becomes a residential low density, and the new zoning would be a rural residential. Is that correct? And so how does that, I guess, how do you know that, how do we make sure that happens? Because at some point, at that point, it just becomes, you've now taken it out of this designation. So maybe that's something, if you could address that process, because I felt a little like it was so hanging out there after you've redesignated it. I also do want to comment, because I feel, I agree very much so with Brian about these, shifting these policies that are more programmatic. I felt like they really can be moved, and you know, it makes sense. There were maybe a couple that maybe could go either way for me, and I can provide specific feedback on that. But I felt like that was actually a good approach. So I just wanted to put that out there, and that there was I'll provide if there was one other response to a comment, but I'll provide it in writing when I remember.
Okay, Jill.
Great, thank you. We do have quite a few responses here, and we'll try to go through them quickly, but we think it's important to do it while this is fresh in the room. Starting with the open space for conservation land use designation that is proposed for this update. The definition is actually already, it's in your draft, and in fact, it anticipated the range of conditions that properties would be in that might be applicable to it, such as the Guerrero wetlands or the areas A and B at Pacific Ridge and a number of others. The last sentence for the definition refers to this designation applies to 247 acres of land in public ownership designated as ESHA, as well as areas with recorded deed restrictions for habitat conservation. I know that's a soft touch on it, but that it was fully our intention to, we were thinking about area A and B in that second part of the sentence. Again, we will do the legal research on that, but we still think that those designations are more protective than a PD would be. The county property at the end of Magnolia, Commissioner Reddick is right on with regards to your city staff's intention there. We were approached by San Mateo County staff who were actually interested in coming up with a housing site, and they were looking for quite a few more units to go in that area, and in a really different configuration. They own a lot of land in that area. It's in a planned development designation right now. The appropriate designation for your updated land use plan should probably be Regional Parks and Recreation, which is consistent with the open space from the bluff inward. That's kind of a combination of owners between county and city and state parks in particular. So that fenced area, which is, in our opinion, already completely disturbed, has the one small house. We had suggested to them that they could fit probably up to two duplexes, for example, or some way to do something very low rise, 1 story. We couldn't see adding more than 4 units into that area, and that was already pushing it. So that's why you see 5 in the work that we did. It includes the house that's already there. The challenge that I think Vice Chair Benjamin brought forward is true. They do not have as much of a connection between the staff who would live in the residence and which particular county park facility they would be serving. And that can change over time. And that's something that we're exploring with them and trying to learn about, but we want to be really open about what that is. That's a lot easier to deal with than all the other overlay designations that we've looked at. They did come to us. They are working really hard as a county on affordable housing. So we were trying to find something to propose to you for your consideration. The language in the staff report about the buffer, Brittany can answer that. That came from Coastal Commission staff.
Yes, without directly quoting the email, I was almost nearly directly quoting the email from the Coastal Commission staff about buffers and how there may be circumstances where a reduced buffer might be more appropriate to accommodate existing development patterns, or where it may be more appropriate to increase the buffer next to largely undeveloped areas, as we do see both of those conditions in Half Moon Bay.
All right, she'll get some more turns in a second. Moving on to resource-dependent uses. We're glad that we're getting some feedback about this. Just note that we have a specific comment from the Coastal Conservancy about this. They were seeking that camping be included in the city's definition for resource-dependent uses. So this came from that particular agency, and that's why we, this was actually brought up in the Committee for Green Foothills letter. It's, I think, one of the last comments in that letter, and Brittany's response cites different LCPs that have a range of uses included in their resource-dependent uses. Camping was in, which one? Santa Monica Mountains. So we can do some more research and find out who's doing what where, but I think what's really important is what we've heard from you tonight is what's right for Half Moon Bay and what really is appropriate here and the controls around it so that it's safe and working well with the resource area. So a couple more. So the broad perspective on the plan developments and that specific red line that we received from Coastal Commission that we conveyed to you for the Venice Beach as an example. So I think Commissioner Polgar summed it up really well in terms of what's missing. We're going to have to be really careful about where it goes. Brittany was presenting, for example, the height limit that's in the visual resources section of the LCP right now, that 15-foot height limit for areas that are designated on the visual resources overlay map for broad ocean views. What we had done in this update was put that height limit right into the PDs because we've been working with developers who are looking at these PDs and not finding some of the development restrictions that are applicable to them because they live in other chapters of the book. So we are living right along with you in how we like this to work. So there's several things we can do to respond robustly to the Coastal Commission staff direction and maintain what you have, but we need to be really careful about it. One is to review all of those policies and make sure that they're either covered in the factored policies with the ability of any of the factored policies to touch into other chapters, or the constraint or other design need or development goal is clearly presented in the narrative, or another level of this is to actually cite policies with the always including but not limited to type of language. So for example, if that height came back into your visual resources chapter, that could be cited in the Venice PD or some of the other PDs that are actually designated in broad ocean views. So there's different tools for doing it. We understand that they really want to maintain their master planning ability. So really what they said in their letter is, don't pre-master plan it, because then if we certify this and something else comes in, it's difficult for us to really start that over. And so we're threading a needle, and we're working on how to do that well. Your input is helping us a lot, but those are some of the considerations that we're making. Commissioner Benjamin, I do want to go through some of your specific policies, because I think they're really good examples, and it will help. Maybe you'll have more dialogue about it, but it at least will help staff. First of all, with regards to cultural resources, our understanding of the Coastal Act is that it is focused on archaeological and paleontological resources, and we don't have paleo, so we're always focused on archaeological resources, and that's what your existing document includes. Historic resources don't have to be included in your LCP, and we discussed that with the staff. So although we do think they're important for other reasons, such as visual resource areas, but historic resources are actually not covered in the current LCP. And so that policy A3, I think, was one of our more generalized policies. It would be revised if historic resources were taken out of that chapter and put into a general plan element. The whole chapter would get back into the scope, similar to what you have now, but with all these updated policies. And of course, we also have the new tribal policies that need to be in your LCP.
And if I could just jump in the moment here while it's fresh in the air, where does the interaction between historic resources and cultural resources begin?
I think with the definitions of what a historic resource is, and we've got it defined in the chapter, and it's mostly a structure, a place. There's a range of reasons why. I can't recall.
I get the part about historic. Yeah. I'm trying to figure out if there are also cultural resources, thinking being that cultural resources are part of a coastal LCP.
Right. That is true. We changed the name of the chapter to cultural resources because we needed a broader name to include historic. And so maybe we've misled you about cultural resources, because that really isn't the focus of the Coastal Act.
Okay.
So
I'll let that one go for now.
Okay, and we can look at it together. Okay, policies, a couple policies that you brought up that I think we need to be clear on. 615 and 6-151. 615 is on page 5, the reporting of biological sightings. Perhaps, so ignore the title. Really, this is about public education and encouraging people to participate. So let's use this one as an example of the lens that Coastal Commission staff asked us to use, which was specifically, does this policy help you in your review of a coastal development permit? And or would it be of service to the Coastal Commission if they were reviewing an appeal of a city-granted permit? And there are other policies in that chapter about biological resource inventories and mapping and all the things that we must do. None of that was taken out, but this is a do more and encourage your public to do it. And that's why we cited this one and not some of the other ones. So I wanted it to be, I was concerned because it sounded like we were stripping out, taking care of that. But if you go back into chapter 6, you will see that there are plenty of those policies that are still in there.
Yeah, and I wanted to respond to Jimmy's comment just a little bit. I mean, my understanding and my background working with the agencies is generally if there's suitable habitat, it's assumed that species are present. And so any surveys that are conducted to find presence or non-presence, generally mitigation is based on the assumption that species are present, and not lacking, any verifiable sightings.
We're in complete agreement, and this is an illustration of the context, right? Because the language that's being stripped out is a really good condition on development. If you find them, you report them. There's probably a condition in our boilerplate, or should be, that looks like that. But in the context of, encourage people when they see it to report it, I get it. So thank you.
Okay, so that's similar to 6.151, which is also an education and outreach condition that goes, it's nice on top of other conditions that get at the actual issue that needs to be considered through development review. 742, the emergency warning system, we believe that really has a great home in the safety element. We understand that this is an important topic that has been brought up many times, and so we'll go back and look at it. And but whether or not this is something that is a matter for development review is that's a really interesting new way of looking at all of these policies, and that's what we've been trying to do. So that's why some of them surprised you. We've also gone back through, for example, the last sentence on 776 about fire flow. That needs to stay in here. It's in the narrative. We're concerned about losing that too, but there's a big part of that policy that's programmatic. So you're right, it's not going to be a simple process. This was just a first quick cut to give you big picture of what we think they want. And we'll go back now and see if we are in line with what their direction is. I mean, we heard a comment tonight at the podium that we need to be really mindful about what their direction is and what their intention is with the direction. So that's why we've been vetting this with you in this manner. Did you have any more for follow-up on? That's what we've got for tonight, and our next step is, of course, to see you in a few weeks on October, I keep forgetting the date.
29th.
Thank you. And with the City Council, it's a 5th Tuesday. We'll be in the Ted Adcock Community Center in a joint study session format, and we're really looking forward to having council with you. Thank you.
Very good. And just to reiterate, all the materials can be found on that website up there, right? www.planhmb.org. So we'll close that item, move on to the director's report.
We've been scurrying to put this together today, and I don't have much. You're going to see us in 2 weeks with the appeal on the Greenbrier property, and probably a study session for a proposed small mixed-use infill development. So we'll try to have that for you. You'll have a little bit lighter than what you've had recently, which should give you some bandwidth for the following week.
Very good. Planning Commission communications, I'll just add one. I happened to sneak a peek at Twitter, and John Dowdy worked his magic, and Caltrans is moving a generator to keep the Tom Lantos tunnels open. So just a quick update. That's just what I saw on the news. So we'll see if that sticks. Anybody else have anything? Okay, so with that, we're going to adjourn.